I think this is of such consequence as he's on his way to Israel. And wow. So we are up. Hello, Bernadette. How you doing, sweetie? Everybody like and share, like and share. I know I'm coming to you at an odd time, but here it is. I was able to get David Swanson. Oh, and I'm so excited to have him today because I want to talk about the Trump. Well, the Nobel, it seems like the Nobel Committee really wanted to give him this peace prize. And let's talk about it. Because certainly Netanyahu and a lot of people were pushing for it. And I think we need to talk about it. So we're up in 20 seconds. And it's always a joy to have. I have my notebook right here so I can take notes as you're talking. So I just don't want you to just go on and do your thing. And we're up in 5, 4. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. It's a joy to be with you. Once again, there's so much to talk about in the world today. A little bit later, we'll be talking about the nonviolent resistance that we are looking to organize against these ICE raids in Chicago and around the country. Nonviolent resistance is the way. I really, really do believe. And speaking of, nonviolence, war, and peace, the Nobel Prize Committee, Peace Prize. Well, the Nobel Prize Committee awarded their prizes, and the Peace Prize was among them. And of course, whenever you hear people memorialize Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, one of the first things that they say is that he was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. And when he won it, it meant something really, it was really of tremendous importance because it was really the Western world blessing this movement for freedom and justice in the United States and around the world. And that is how it was received. But today one has to ask the question, what does the Nobel Peace Prize really mean? Because we have to look at the person who did get the Nobel Peace Prize, someone who wanted the United States and Israel to come into Venezuela and overthrow the revolutionary government of President Maduro. There's no government that is perfect, but he is in the tradition of President Hugo Chavez, who was beloved by his people. And yet she is someone who is an imperialist. Certainly she supports an imperialist agenda. Is that what the Nobel Peace Prize Committee is doing now? And what about the push for President Trump to receive the Nobel Peace Prize? They said that he has resolved so many conflicts all around the world. And of course, chief among them, this Gaza-Israel conflict. But has the issue been resolved in Gaza? We've got to go all the way around the world on this particular issue with none other than David Swanson, Executive Director of World Beyond War. Of course, he is an organizer with Roots Action and just really one of the world's leading voices on peace and one of the great analysts of where we are right now and how we got here. And where we need to end up. So, I wanted to have this discussion because I read something that you wrote, quite frankly, that I thought was absolutely appealing and very compelling. The Nobel Committee tried its best to give Trump a peace prize. You just put it all the way out there. And it seems that they did. And it was written by you, published on the 10th. And you started, the Nobel Committee has frequently given the Peace Prize to major war makers and frequently to do-gooders whose work in a variety of fields has been unrelated to abolishing war. It is also often given the prize to opponents and victims of the targets of Western empire, but it is never given the prize to open advocates of war and fascistic government. Trump was never going to be given the prize directly. Trump is not the right type of warmonger, you continued. Nobody could do it with a straight face. Zelensky was saying he'd support Trump for the Peace Prize if Trump were to send him long-range missiles with which to start World War III. Norway has been worried about what horrible things Trump might do upon failing to be given the prize. Trump has pushed NATO members into unprecedented levels of military spending while fueling wars in Ukraine and Palestine, supporting Israeli war making around Western Asia, murdering the occupants of fishing boats, and declaring his right to attack Venezuela, proclaiming his intention to practice for more wars using U.S. cities as training grounds. The Nobel Committee could not risk having him show up to accept its Peace Prize and denounce him for having some non white people in the room or for having given the prize to someone he hates. So let's talk about this with you, David Swanson. Let's unpack this substantial baggage. And everyone, as we do, please go to join Bernadette on the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe there and share the show. Share the show. Help us with the algorithm. We need you to do that. And meet me on X at Santita J, Instagram, Santita Jackson IG, and the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page. Uh, David Swanson, welcome home. I can't just say welcome to the show. Well, what do you mean? You are always stirring up the pot. What do you mean by when you say that the Nobel Committee tried its best to give Donald Trump the Peace Prize? What do you mean?
Well, they did really the closest thing they could possibly do to giving him the Peace Prize. They could not give it directly to him for the reasons you've read from my article, which I was going to say, but I write better than I speak, so I'm glad you read it. That he's not their type of warmonger. He's an open warmonger. He's someone who renames the Department of Defense honestly as the Department of War. He's someone who cheers for war, who revels in sadistic cruelty. He doesn't package war as a humanitarian, philanthropic, benevolent operation for the good of the world. He's not Barack Obama. He's not the European Union. He's not even Henry Kissinger. He's an open fascistic militarist buffoon. He's not their type of guy. They're happy to give it to war makers. They've given the Nobel Peace Prize to numerous presidents of Ethiopia, United States, Colombia. They give it to people who wage wars left and right, who maybe have paused for a minute or signed a peace agreement or just got elected and haven't had a chance to do anything yet, but it's kind of a dig at the previous guy, George W. Bush, who they didn't like, but they're not going to give it to somebody like Trump. So, they'll give it to the European Union, maybe second biggest war making machine on earth, but they'll do it for peace-like reasons. So what can they do? They could ignore Trump altogether. We're going to just give it to somebody else. More than half the time, they give it to somebody for some wonderful cause that has nothing to do with war or peace. They give it to somebody who works anti-poverty or anti-racism or anti-climate destruction, all wonderful, great causes, but they have nothing to do with what the Nobel Peace Prize was created for. Or they give it to somebody who is working to reform war a little bit and make it more proper. So they give it to an organization that works against chemical weapons, or a bunch of people who work against rape as a tool of war. And so let's make war proper, killing without particular weapons, particular atrocities. Let's reform war. They've done that. I mean, that's the closest they've come to doing what they're supposed to do. Last year, they gave it to, I think they were running out of time. They gave it to survivors of the nuclear bombs in Japan, who actually oppose at least nuclear weapons, if not all war. So that was, the closest they've come in maybe decades to what they're supposed to do. But the other thing they often do is give it, as you read in my article, they give it to somebody who's an opponent and probably a victim of one of the few most horrible governments on earth that's not armed and supported and trained by the US military. It's a very short list. It's China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, right? And so 2 years ago, they gave it, not for the first time, to an opponent of the Iranian government who's against the Iranian government, who's locked up in prison by the Iranian government. And when they do this, they're supporting the cause of U.S. empire. I mean, what have we seen since then? We've seen bombings of Iran. We've seen military attacks on Iran and threats to Iran, as might have been predicted. The one saving grace, I would say, is that the past two opponents of the government of Iran who have gotten the Nobel Peace Prize have also very clearly and strongly opposed a Western attack on their country. They don't like their government. They also don't want their country bombed or invaded. Now they've gone a step further. Now they've gone to the nation most loudly being threatened with a new war in the very moment by the US president. And they've given it to someone who's not only an opponent of the Venezuelan government, who wants the Venezuelan government overthrown, but is a cheerleader for a US war on Venezuela, who has asked the United States to sanction her own country, which has resulted in many thousands of deaths, which is resulting right this moment in horrible, painful starvation of many people in Venezuela, and also urged military intervention by the United States and by Israel, who has cheered for Israel's war crimes in a moment when they are the most despised and opposed and condemned war crimes happening in the world, with the most global awareness. She's a cheerleader for the genocide in Gaza, but she's also asked Israel to come invade her own country, and the United States invade her own country and overthrow her government, and no matter who starves and who dies a violent death. And so they didn't give it to Trump. They gave it to his next war. He just moments, just days after Trump has told the U.S. Congress and the world that he has the right to go and launch a war in Venezuela. Venezuela has the effrontery to be located in the region that's under the responsibility of the Southern Command. Well, what the hell is the Southern Command? It's not a legal entity. It's just a portion of the U.S. military that calls itself the commander and controller of that section of the globe, like the Northern Command and the Central Command. The whole globe is divided up into commands by the U.S. imperial military. And so Trump is blowing up boats that virtually everybody, even the most warmongering pundits, recognize is simply murder. The only excuse anyone's offering is the usual, well, if it's war, then it can't be murder. But of course, it's still illegal if it's war. And what makes it war? Nothing much. Although in the Senate, just days ago, a couple of Democratic senators, Kaine and Sanders, I think, forced a vote on whether to, use the War Powers Resolution to forbid any war on Venezuela, as if it isn't already forbidden by the UN Charter and the US Constitution and so forth. And that, of course, failed by two votes, with one Democrat voting the wrong way and like three Republicans voting the right way. But they made sure it would fail, and which sort of amounts to the Senate okaying a war on Venezuela, so which may be worse than the situation in the House, where Congresswoman Omar and others have tried to force a vote, as they're legally allowed to force a vote under the War Powers Resolution on whether to block a particular war, redundantly declare a particular war illegal. And the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, just won't hold a vote. He's legally obliged to hold the vote, but he won't do it because he's a lawless criminal. Just as he won't confirm a woman to the House of Representatives who's been elected, because he doesn't want her voting on anything, including the Epstein files. And so we have this lawless situation in the House, but at least they haven't given their stamp of approval the way the Senate has. And so in this moment, when the Congress is falling apart, when the public is distracted and ignorant and upset and outraged by, a longer list of crimes and abuses than we can keep track of, what do? They take the next war that Trump wants, and give the Nobel Peace Prize essentially to his war. They might as well have given it to the CIA. They might as well have given it to him. But that's not the way they do things. They give it to a woman who's a politician in the name of democracy, and they declare overthrowing the government of Venezuela the key to upholding democracy on earth. And so now you have the right wing, fascist, curious Trump supporter, part of the US population gung ho for anything Trump does, including attacking Venezuela. And of course, Wall Street and the capitalists and the oil barons, Ms. Machado wants to turn over the oil to the profiteers, the national property of Venezuela, the biggest such property in the world. But you also have the liberals. You also are going to have the Democrats, because they're going to see the Nobel Peace Prize, and they're going to see this glorious international, respectable, humane awards ceremony. Everybody's going to have coats and ties. Everybody's going to say democracy at least 35 times, and it's going to be all about the global defense of democracy against the autocrats, against the authoritarians. We must stand up for democracy. And Trump is, possibly going to be bombing Venezuela, and these people are going to be confused about what they think about that. So, some damage has been done here.
Well, help me to understand who the Nobel Committee, who are they? I mean, because I don't know how you pivot from, yeah, I mean, it's been 60 years, but I don't know how you pivot from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the South African freedom fighters, to the present awardee. Um, because these were, well, perhaps I need to go back.
Well,
First of all, who are they, and upon what basis do they grant these awards? Because I don't know who they are, and we're in awe of the Nobel Peace Prize, but who comprises the committee? Who are these people?
well, I'm just looking for their names as you speak, but I think they are largely Norwegian legislators, and
I mean, do they?
I'm
I
not.
mean, I mean, it appears that they support imperialism.
Well, the thing about Norway is that it used to be a pretty respectably independent and peace-loving country, that has gradually been dragged more and more into warmongering. And in the past just couple of years, there has been an explosion of dozens of new US military bases across Norway and Sweden and Finland. Sweden and Finland have now joined NATO as well as Norway. And these bases, the US troops that are going to now be occupying Norway in significant numbers, have been given the freedom to do anything they want anywhere in Norway, not just within the walls of their bases. And Norway has been dragged into, right now NATO is doing a nuclear war rehearsal. They're practicing how to destroy the world, and Norway is part of it. Norway is part of all these NATO wars and NATO operations, NATO rehearsals of wars. And so the notion of NATO as something other than a US puppet, as something,
Mhm.
right? The coup in Venezuela is preceded by the coup in Norway, right? Norway
Mhm.
is part of the US empire. And so, yes, they gave a Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Martin Luther King. And I think that as a model, principled, strategic, courageous, effective user of nonviolent tools in a situation where many would call for and were calling for violence. He was a very admirable person to give such a prize to. He hadn't yet done much against the war machine directly, specifically, right? His turn against the war in Vietnam, which was so wonderful and so impactful, came after he got the
So
Nobel.
do you think that had he, because he was really in line to become the chief spokesperson, the chief opponent of the war when he was killed. Indeed, after literally he was killed a year to the day, to the minute that he stepped into the pulpit at Riverside Church, April 4th, 1967, and announced his opposition to the war. And Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, uh, famed theologian pastor who had been his chief of staff, said to him after he'd finished, "Martin, you've just signed your death warrant." And he said, "I know."
Yeah.
So he did not enter into that unmindfully. And many people, including my father, said that, desegregating America was fine, but there's some third rails that you touch that
Right.
can get you taken out of here. I saw it happen with him, with the Middle East. Well, so many things that he could have been taken out over. But do you think that, just given what we're seeing with the Nobel Committee, that if he had become a chief opponent of, if he had been allowed to become the lead spokesperson for the Vietnam, for the anti-Vietnam War effort, that he was really stepping into, because he, as you know, he was the lead speaker at the biggest anti-war march of the era in New York City. Like more than 1 million people were there. Do you think that he would have been denied the Peace Prize had he become the anti-war spokesperson?
That's a very interesting question. I think certainly today he would. I mean, it's an impossible question to answer. There
Right.
isn't today anyone exactly like him, and there isn't anyone exactly like him had he developed as you describe either. I think that he was understood even by the committee back then, which had more principle and character than the Nobel Committee now, and it was a world that was less convinced of the goodness of war than now. I think even they would have struggled had he actually been someone who did what Alfred Nobel's will said the prize was for. That is, someone who opposed wars and sought the abolition of weapons and sought peace congresses among nations. Uh, but I also wonder about the fact that he sort of did that after winning the prize. And there's some who may, to be generous and to give them some credit, they may think that the prize sometimes has a good impact on its recipient. Its recipient is encouraged and funded. By the way, they give the prize to so many wealthy and prominent people now that we forget the purpose of it was to fund peace movements. But people are encouraged and funded by this peace prize, and they go out and do more and better and with a bigger voice and platform because of the prize, after the prize. And this has been the case in a lot of cases, and particularly with Dr. King. And so I sometimes wonder, when they gave the prize to Barack Obama, were they thinking, oh, there was one time 30 years ago we gave the prize to a black guy from the US, and then he went out and earned it afterwards. Like, maybe that'll happen this time. But when you look at what we know of their internal debates and discussion over whether to give it to Obama, it had nothing to do with that. It was about the fact that he was famous and popular and would bring more attention to the prize. And everybody thinks the prize brings attention to the person. They thought Obama would bring attention to their prize. And
Let's look at that a minute, because we can juxtapose the prize going to Dr. King and then newly elected president, newly installed President Obama at the time. Dr. King had opposed Jim Crow in America at tremendous risk. I mean, this is a time when really the humanity of Black people had been questioned. This was not 10 years after Emmett Till had been murdered so viciously. And we forget that so many bodies had been in pursuit of his body in the river they saw a lot of other bodies. The only way that they were able to identify him was by the signet ring that his father had given to him, and his father, of course, had died during the war, Second World War. Um, so, I mean, when you look at President Barack Obama, do you think that they were trying to legitimate uh, the Nobel Prize by conferring it upon him? Because it
I
happened
think
so early, I didn't quite understand how the justification for giving it to him, because he had not gotten a chance
in,
to do anything in his presidency,
or
right?
prior, he really hadn't done anything at all to earn it
Yeah.
other than win an election where the other party had been painted very much as the war party, very understandably so. George W. Bush had been, driving these insane wars for several years, and Barack Obama, despite very little basis, had been painted as the peace candidate. This was 2000, the 2008 election, right? In 2006, the top concern of voters was overwhelmingly ending the war in Iraq, and they had given the Democrats both houses of Congress precisely to end the war in Iraq. And then the Democrats had, of course, escalated and continued the war in Iraq, smacked the US public in the face. But the US public still wanted somebody who would end the wars. And candidates who were really anti-war were kept off television, were kept out
Mhm.
of debates, were kept out of the two political parties that you're allowed to vote for. And so that was it. You get two choices. One becomes the war candidate, one the peace candidate. Just as for most people, either Trump or Biden was the peace candidate because the other one was the war candidate, even though it's a hideous joke to call either of them a peace candidate. And so there was this idea afloat in the media, and even more so outside of the United States, where, when you look from a distance, you get on even more rose-colored glasses. And people in Europe thought, oh, the United States has voted in peace instead of war. And then Obama went and made a speech about how he didn't really like nuclear weapons. And, we should end them in some future century after our lifetime and this sort of nonsense. But it was anti-nuclear weapons. It wasn't pro-nuclear weapons. And so that added to this aura of he's the peace guy and he's against wars and even weapons. Oh my God. People love to think things are a little bit better than they actually are, right? As you mentioned the peace deal in Gaza. It's the furthest thing from a peace deal. It's not good news. It's bad news, but everybody wants good news so desperately that they treat it as good news. And so there was this actual belief that the United States had imposed peace and disarmament on its government. When Obama came in and created the massive escalation of nuclear weapons building and deployment, the nuclear arms race that the US is now leading, was
Mhm.
largely Obama's creation. But there was this idea that he was going to do the opposite of what you knew he was going to do if you were paying the slightest bit of attention. And so that the generous spin on what the Nobel Committee was up to was that they were convinced he was a peace guy and they could give him a nudge and really make that come true. And of course, that didn't happen. But what we
But what
actually
about
know.
Kissinger? What about Kissinger? I mean, he was very problematic. I mean, wasn't he viewed as a war criminal around the world?
He certainly is today by anyone who's the least bit informed, and to a large extent, he was at the time. And he was a horrible, outrageous, hideous choice. Someone famously said that irony had died the day they gave the Nobel Peace Prize to Kissinger. But they didn't give it to him for screaming, I want more wars. They gave it to him for supposedly being a leader in making peace. In fact, they didn't just give it to him, but they gave it to his partner in the peace agreement as well. They gave it to two people, which they haven't always done that. In other cases, more recently in Colombia and elsewhere, they've picked just one side, we'll give it to the more prestigious president and not the leader of the filthy rebels, even though the two sides make a peace agreement. And this it's not just Kissinger. They often want to give it to a president or a prime minister or a senator, even if they've long been a warmonger and are going to go right back to being a warmonger, but because they've made peace or they've said something about peace in this moment. This was the case not too long ago with the president of Ethiopia, right? Who's not a peacemaker, and so there's this bias that was not in Alfred Nobel's will and was not in the very early years of the Nobel Peace Prize, but has been in it for decades. They want famous, respectable presidents and prime ministers and secretaries of state and foreign affairs. That's who they want. And so it wasn't that out of line that they gave it to Kissinger. I mean, it's a horrible, outrageous disgrace. It's probably the best example of how they've gone wrong. They've given it to Kissinger. They never gave it to Gandhi. What's the matter with them? But they've given it to a lot of people who are a lot like Kissinger.
Well, I mean, it just seems like there is if you really look at the Nobel Prize, as you said, what is it about then? Is it the Western establishment affirming someone? Is it affirming a position, affirming someone who's a messenger for the West and for imperialism? What is it? I am confused.
They judging by what they not what they say but by what they do, and a little bit by what they say as well. They are dedicated to Western empire. They are dedicated to supporting the opponents of the targets. The U.S. government and military support almost all of the very worst, most oppressive governments on earth, even by
Mhm.
the reviews of the U.S. State Department itself. But there are these few that they don't: China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela. The Nobel Committee is dedicated to targeting those outliers, those opponents of the rules-based order, those traitors against the Western empire of truth, justice, and democracy. Uh, they also are dedicated to supporting war. They believe that war is justifiable, rational, necessary. I mean, Barack Obama, as far as I've read, is the only Nobel Peace Prize recipient who actually gave a pro-war acceptance speech. But there was nothing he said in that acceptance speech that was at odds with the general beliefs of the Nobel Committee. We live in an era when it's no longer acceptable to say, as in Alfred Nobel's will, here's a prize to help rid the world of war. That's considered outrageous. What you have to do is have war by the proper people in the proper ways. And this is what the Nobel Committee seems to believe in. You need to have war without chemical or biological weapons, ideally with lots of nuclear weapons standing by but never used. You have to have war in proper battlefields, with the proper people dying without women and children being killed, or at least not tortured. It's okay if they're killed, but let's not torture anybody, and so forth. Proper war by the rules, and this is what they believe in. So and so they give somebody's in prison in China for opposing the Chinese government, they get a Nobel Peace Prize. Someone's in prison in England, like Julian Assange, for opposing the U.S. war machine, they would never, ever, ever get a Nobel Peace Prize. Uh, someone is working to end the genocide in Gaza and boycott, divest, and sanction the Israeli government. They will never get a Nobel Peace Prize. But someone is exposing the crimes of Russia in Ukraine, they're going to get a Nobel Peace Prize. Remember when there was no topic in the news other than Ukraine, a couple of maybe 3 years back now, and It was guaranteed they were going to do something about Ukraine because they're going for the spotlight too. They're going for whatever's the top news story. And so you thought, well, maybe they'll give it to an opponent of war on each side and be balanced. What did they do? They gave it to an opponent of the Russian war in Russia. They gave it to an opponent of the Russian war in Belarus, and they gave it to an opponent of the Russian war in Ukraine. They gave it to three opponents of the Russian war making in three countries, including in Ukraine. But they didn't give it to anyone who had one word to say against Ukrainian war making. Right. So I mean, if you look behind just the first headlines and paragraphs and the cheerleading of, oh, a woman got it, or someone from the global south got it, or whatever, the excitement is, it's very clear what they're about, and it has nothing to do with peace.
Well, help me to understand who the Nobel Prize winner is this year. I mean, just because in your article you gave us footage of, well, explain it, because I mean, honestly, I was dumbfounded, and I thank you for presenting, letting her speak, giving her say, as they say.
Yeah, there are Maria Corina Machado. She's from Venezuela and she's a politician. She has campaigned for the presidency of Venezuela. She would like to be the new president, prime minister, viceroy, colonial ruler on behalf of Washington, D.C., of Venezuela. And
No, that was
she
interesting that you viceroy, because that's a colonial ruler. So you said, are you implying, am I to infer that she would be an American puppet, and she'd be like Tony
she
Blair, the overlord for
she
Western
would
world?
she would clearly like to be a U.S. puppet. Now, if she had her choice, would she like to be an independent ruler of Venezuela? I don't know, maybe, but she is clearly strategizing that the way to win is to be a U.S. puppet. And she doesn't object to that in the way that many people, many friends of mine in Venezuela would, because she is a radical right winger. She agrees with Donald Trump, not just on his desire to attack Venezuela, but on his politics. She wants to take Venezuela's wealth in terms of oil and minerals and so forth, and privatize them and let wealthy, let billionaires and vultures and extractivist corporations get rich off the stuff that's in Venezuela. She wants to do away with Chavismo. She wants to do away with any shifting of the wealth to the poor, any assistance to the poor, any uh, investment in education and healthcare and environment. Of course, the very best thing that Venezuela could do would be to keep the oil under the ground, right?
Mhm.
And cooperate with other well-meaning countries in Latin America, and if there were one in North America, on green energy collaborations, which other leaders in Latin America have proposed. We've got hot sunshine. We can collaborate with you on green energy investment if you weren't so dedicated to destroying the world as fast as possible. And so she wants the oil out. She wants the wealth that comes from it concentrated. She wants the poor of Venezuela further impoverished. She wants to be a good right wing leader of her country in collaboration with the Pentagon and the CIA. And this is not new, right? And it's not only her, right? There have been other proposals. Juan Guaido was for some years proposed as the U.S. educated, U.S. trained, U.S. loyal puppet to run Venezuela. She's the new one, and there are videos around on the internet of her saying we need a Western intervention. We need sanctions, and we need the West to come in and overthrow and protect. And she has written a letter to Prime Minister of Israel while he's engaged in a live streamed genocide, asking for his similar assistance. And, there was a very good report several weeks ago now on the impact of these sanctions in numerous countries, including in Venezuela, that found them to be as deadly as many wars, right? The sanctions are not, technicalities here of little interest to ordinary people. They are deadly weapons. When you cut Venezuela off from banks and financing and trade, it causes poverty. And this is what's happening, and she's cheering for it. I mean, a brutal, immoral, and as far as I can tell, illegal under the United Nations, under the Geneva Conventions. You're punishing a population for political reasons. Illegal sanctions on her own country. I mean, she shouldn't be getting a Nobel Peace Prize. She should be getting an indictment from the International Criminal Court, as should Tony Blair for his role in destroying Iraq. And so this is, this is as close. I mean, Trump would never say something should go to a woman, and he would never say something should go to someone other than him. And he's already protested and moaned about not getting the Nobel Peace Prize. But this was the closest they could come to giving it to him.
Well, why to her? I mean, are they, as you said earlier, are they sanctioning the U.S., and really it's not just the U.S., I would say, the Western attacks on Venezuela? Because, all governments, including the progressive ones, have their challenges, but there was a revolution there. And Maduro carries that mantle of Chavez. And which was the moneyed interest hated Chavez until he died. And
And still do, yeah.
they still hate him. They hate Maduro because because they thought that he would be a weak successor. It turns out that he is not. And I cannot help because, to fully disclose, Chavez is someone we knew, and he honored Reverend by giving Reverend Jackson his the highest honor that a country can bestow upon a person, which is the highest honor from Venezuela. And Reverend Jackson was the last person to eulogize President Chavez before President Maduro, and such was his respect for Reverend and the anti-imperialist struggle that we wage in the United States, right?
I remember, if I'm not mistaken, I
Mhm.
remember Reverend Jackson talking to Hugo Chavez and telling him and running off a list of U.S. coups and coup attempts around the world,
Yes.
from like Iran and Nicaragua and on through. And like, I bet he hasn't heard a prominent person from the United States do that before, like.
Oh, absolutely. But I think when you're in this freedom struggle, you see it as one. And Reverend Dr. King was growing into that. I mean,
Yeah.
he was going beyond. I mean, but remember, he was at the Nkrumah inauguration in the 50s, and Nkrumah went to college in the undergrad in the United States, and he was inspired by the struggle here. I mean, we are all connected to each other. I mean, I think of the Irish Republican Army and how they connect to us, because they were also very connected to Reverend Jackson and to the freedom struggles all around the world. I'm trying to find out, as I look at Tony Blair, as you said, who is problematic, and really he's an extension of the UK, which helped to start the madness in the Mideast in the first place.
Yeah. Well,
And I look at Miss Machado, and I'm like, what are we doing? This is because the Nobel Peace Prize now, to me, it doesn't look like a peace prize at all, David Swanson.
yeah, well, just to say something quick about Maduro and Machado and Blair, I mean, I think a lot of criticisms about Maduro may be perfectly true. He may have done lots of horrible things, and he may use the U.S. hostility and abuse of his country as an excuse for doing horrible things. And the U.S. ought to know that that tends to happen. It's one of the results of its policies. Machado is somebody who talks the right talk. She's going to show up in Oslo and give a speech about democracy and human rights. She's not going to talk about vengeance and viciousness and violence. She's going to talk about war as a cleansing operation to do away with the evils of the horrible abusers of democracy. And even though she publicly supports Donald Trump and has immediately dedicated the Nobel Peace Prize to Donald Trump, she's not going to talk the way he would. And yet she's seen in her country by a certain segment as the leader, as the political figure at the front of the overthrow Maduro movement, or vote him out for those who honestly want to vote him out. But Tony Blair shouldn't be on anybody's list of anyone who's respectable in any way, in any room, in any organization, in any activity. I mean, this was a leading public figure, openly lying and advocating illegality and pushing for the horrific destruction of Iraq, and not just Iraq, but Afghanistan. Tony Blair had a harder time dragging his country into the war in Iraq than George W. Bush did. The
Mm.
U.S. public, to our shame, the U.S. public resists these horrors less than other publics, and the British public was outraged. And Tony Blair had to say to George W. Bush in a private meeting, I can't go along with the war on Iraq unless we have a war on Afghanistan first, because I can sell the war on Afghanistan. That people are going to understand that we're pretending that Afghanistan had something to do with 9/11, and so it's revenge. And now, of course, there's nothing, remotely legal. There's not a single law in existence on earth that says you can have a war if it's revenge. And yet everybody in every country's media totally accept revenge as an acceptable, legalish reason for war. And so he got the war on Afghanistan going. And he worked with the United States to get the war on Iraq going, building off the war on Afghanistan. He and his government worked with the U.S. government, as exposed by one brave member of his government, Catherine Gunn, to spy on and blackmail the UN delegations of various small countries to try to get them to vote for a war on Iraq. He Years and years, as the horrors played out in front of everybody's eyes, even if they weren't on your phone, they were on your television and your computer. uh he supported endless killing and slaughter and outrages. So, uh as I said, Tony Blair should be in handcuffs in The Hague along with Maria Corina Machado, but the U.S. gang leaders should be first in line, right? George W. Bush should not be some honored elder, portrait painter guy. He should be first in line, along with Dick Cheney, along with numerous U.S. presidents and vice presidents and Congress members. They should be lined up if we're going to start prosecuting war criminals, as, to its great credit, the International Criminal Court is trying to do with people like Benjamin Netanyahu.
Do you think that I only have a few minutes left here, but I'd like to give it to you because I was watching some of the news shows, and some really believe that President Trump was robbed of the Nobel Peace Prize. I just
Yeah.
think that's what they're saying, and I'd like to know, um, what say you about that? I mean, because they argue vociferously that if if people found him to be more agreeable on a personal level, that he just might have gotten this prize.
Well, that's true, but he would not have deserved it. If the Nobel Committee had thought he could make a respectable figure and talk the right talk, they very well might have given it to him, but he wouldn't have deserved it. None, almost none, maybe none of the people who get it, or the organizations who get it, which was never proposed at all, deserve it if you're looking at what was said in Alfred Nobel's will. But even if you're looking for anybody who has anything remotely tangentially to do with peace, he wouldn't deserve it. Start with what I care about most, money, and get to what everybody else cares about most, Gaza. Starting with the money, he has done more to increase military spending around the world, maybe than anyone else ever, not just anyone alive. He has beaten and badgered NATO members into a commitment to spend 5% of their economies on military spending, as if military spending were a public good to be maximized. And the richer you are, the more you spend. He has dramatically increased U.S. military spending, which has the biggest impact, but he has very dramatically increased, even more than Biden did. And Biden had the war in Ukraine to work with. European NATO member military spending, which is going to have perhaps an equal impact. And if you haven't heard, the military spending leads to the weapons testing and development and the wars. He has also promised to end a war in Ukraine and made zero actual useful effort in that direction, and in fact worsened it and extended it and made it a greater danger of becoming a nuclear war. He has talked about ending numerous wars. 7 regions of the world he claims to have brought peace, and it's not true in a single one of them. And he has not just openly threatened war in Venezuela, not just brought war to U.S. cities, not just glorified war making and declared the right to personally launch wars anywhere he wants, and threatened Venezuela and bombed various places in the Middle East, and supported Israel in bombing various places in the Middle East. He has made Gaza worse, not better. I mean, any momentary reduction in the violence in Gaza is a wonderful thing. I'm all for it, and it's to the credit of all the good people demanding peace that Trump has any interest in getting it. But he's not taken any steps to make Israel any more likely to uphold any agreement once they get their hostages out. In fact, Israeli officials are openly saying that they're going to resume the bombing and the destruction and the killing the minute they get their hostages out. He has done nothing to engage with Palestinians in a negotiated agreement. In fact, the last time Palestinians were seriously engaged in negotiating an agreement, he let Israel blow them up in Qatar. They literally kill anybody trying to negotiate peace from the Palestinian side. And then they go and dig up a war criminal from England and drag him in and say he's going to run your country and call it a peace agreement. I mean, if I showed up here today with Tony Blair and said, Santita, he's going to run your show from now on and it's a peace agreement, be happy. I mean, you wouldn't be dancing, right? You'd be, get that guy off my channel, right? So it's the opposite of a peace agreement to say, hi, Tony Blair's going to run your country for it. No, that's not a peace agreement. It's not liberation. It's not human rights. It's not respect. It's not sovereignty. It's not a free Palestine, which is yet to be achieved.
So, because I've got Abraham here from Venezuela, he is a faithful listener, and he said, "Good afternoon," uh, and he's so sweet to me. The queen of my life, bless his heart, from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, free and sovereign people. Excuse me. He says, "We don't want war, but we won't allow ourselves to be invaded without consequences. The United States would regret this for the rest of its life." And he continues, the Nobel Peace Prize. should also be awarded to Benjamin Netanyahu and Adolf Hitler posthumously, since it was awarded to the murderer and leader of invasions of wars, Barack Obama, he said, and then to Santos. The prize has lost its worldwide credibility, he says. And now they're going to give it to Maria Corina Machado. And he said, this is the world that is upside down, which is, he said, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King must be turning in his grave over so much discredit. Wow.
Well, the only bit I disagree with is, of course, that the one thing Donald Trump wants is a violent response from Venezuela, and
Yeah.
threats of a violent response from Venezuela, just as he wants the people of Chicago to attack the National Guard. This is what he wants. He doesn't want these ice-free zones and nonviolent
Mm-hmm.
protection and resistance and chasing his clowns around playing Darth Vader music and calling the cops on
Mm-hmm.
his masked thugs. He doesn't want any of this creative nonviolent resistance. He wants violent attacks. And it's the same thing he wants in Venezuela. And he won't regret it for the rest of his life. He will treasure it and honor it and react to it with the biggest war machine the world has ever seen.
But
Uh,
David, we haven't won anything. We don't win when we invade people's countries. I mean, they know their terrain, right? And we have not won anything since the Second World War. And I just think it's such hubris for us to feel that we can invade someone's country.
The
You
people of Iraq are not happy because the U.S. never won the war. A lot of them are dead. Their soil is poisoned.
yes,
Their cities are rubble. They're not glad that the U.S. just because the U.S. didn't win the war in Iraq. That
yeah.
doesn't make it a good result for the people of Iraq.
I just, well, help me to understand, where do we go from here? Um, what is
Well,
our takeaway? Because we are. I think we should pay attention. You're going to make me pay attention to her speech.
Well, just to be clear, my goal is not to blame the people of Venezuela for proposing to react the way almost
Of
all people
course,
all over the world do.
of course.
The where we go from here is we go to Washington D.C. and we shut the place down and we turn off the war machine and we stop the flow of weapons and we impeach and remove from office the war criminals. And we need the help of good people around the world to do it because the criminals in Washington D.C. are not doing all keeping all their damage within the United States. They're doing a lot of it abroad. So we need a global movement to put a stop to it.
David Swanson, World Beyond War. And of course, he's organizing with all of my friends and family over at Roots Action. Thank you for breaking this down for us, because when I saw the awarding of this prize to Mrs. Machado, I said, what are they doing? But then I've been saying that about this award for many years now. I don't think that people are really watching. And so I read with great relish what you wrote, because you kind of really helped me to do a reset on the Nobel Peace Prize, and the basis upon which it is really awarded everybody. I think we need to really look at that, just as we really need to look at so many things. We need to look at our election system. We need to look at the fact that we have, wink not, a choice of two parties. I think we need to look at that. We need to look at uh, what is really going on in the world today. When someone who wins the Nobel Peace Prize, David Swanson, is calling for the violent overthrow of her government, and not to, I mean, well, first of all, I don't believe in violent overthrows, but she's doing this on behalf of a small, yes, dare I say, white minority who were removed from power. And she wants to reinstall them, just as Marco Rubio and others want to do that in Cuba. And we can just keep on going down and going down the line. And quite frankly, it's not just white people. You have some imperialists, and she's an imperialist. And that's really what it is. You have imperialists of every single color. So the question is, which side are you on? That's the question they used to ask when my parents were marching and working in the for Dr. King 60 years ago. Which side are you on? I know which side you're on, David Swanson, and I applaud it. World Beyond War, everybody. Please give them your support and Roots Action. Let us get involved, everybody. In a few hours, we'll be talking about uh, ICE and the nonviolent resistance that is being organized against these raids and against what is happening in Chicago, in the Chicagoland area. We'll talk about it a little bit more, a little bit later. So all my love to you, David Swanson. All my love to you, Morning Stars, Abraham. Hang in there down in Venezuela. Hang in there. And remember, nonviolent resistance is the way. God bless you, everybody.